It was late at night in the towering glass building of a prestigious corporate firm. The office was dimly lit, the silence punctuated only by the soft swish of a mop across the gleaming marble floors. James, the janitor, moved methodically from one end of the room to the other. His hands were rough from years of labor, but his movements were steady and purposeful. The faint sound of distant laughter echoed from a nearby meeting room, where a group of executives was celebrating a recent deal. James tried to tune it out. He had work to finish before the night was over. He adjusted his uniform and continued cleaning, wiping down desks and carefully arranging chairs. To him, every detail mattered, even if no one else noticed. Just as James was finishing up in the main hallway, the heavy double doors to the conference room burst open. Mr. Graham, the CEO, strode out, surrounded by his usual entourage of high-ranking executives. His presence commanded attention. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and arrogant demeanor were all part of his persona. James instinctively stepped aside, gripping his mop tightly, trying to make himself invisible as the group approached. "Ah, there he is," Mr. Graham said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "The backbone of our company, the one who keeps this place spotless. Isn't that right, James?" James paused, unsure if he should respond. He simply nodded and resumed his work, hoping the moment would pass quickly. But Mr. Graham was not finished. "Look at him," Mr. Graham said, turning to his colleagues. "You know, James here has the most important job in the building. Without him, this place would fall apart. Floors would be filthy, trash overflowing, absolute chaos." The executives chuckled nervously. Some avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the tone, but none dared to speak up. James kept his head down, focusing on the floor in front of him. His jaw tightened, but he refused to let the words affect him outwardly. "And yet," Mr. Graham continued, his voice growing louder, "despite all his hard work, he still manages to miss a spot or two. James, are you even paying attention? That corner over there looks like it hasn't been touched in days." James looked up briefly, his eyes meeting Mr. Graham's for a fleeting moment. He opened his mouth to reply, but quickly thought better of it. Instead, he silently moved to the corner and began mopping. The group burst into laughter. "You see that?" Mr. Graham said. "A man who knows his place. The world needs people like James. Not everyone can be in the boardroom. Some of us are born to lead, while others are born to mop floors." The laughter grew louder, echoing in the empty hall. James felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. He had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. As the group moved toward the elevators, one of the younger executives hesitated, glancing back at James. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might say something. But then Mr. Graham called out, and the man hurried to catch up, leaving James alone in the hallway. James stood there for a moment, gripping the mop handle tightly. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort it took to contain his frustration. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs before exhaling slowly. "I am more than this," James whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He finished his work in silence, the echo of Mr. Graham's words lingering in his mind. As he locked up the janitor's closet and headed toward the exit, James looked back at the office one last time. The lights from the building illuminated the night sky, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. But deep within that darkness was a spark, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. The night was quieter than usual as James walked home from work. His footsteps echoed through the empty streets, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The humiliation he faced at the hands of Mr. Graham replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. As he approached his modest apartment, he paused for a moment, gazing up at the cracked windows and peeling paint. This wasn't where he had imagined his life would be. James unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the soft hum of a refrigerator and the faint sound of a clock ticking on the wall. His home was small but clean, a testament to his meticulous nature. The dining table was cluttered with unpaid bills and a half-empty cup of coffee. James sighed, setting his bag down and collapsing onto the worn-out couch. He picked up a photo frame from the side table, a picture of him in his cap and gown on graduation day. His smile in the photo was wide and full of hope, a stark contrast to the weary expression he now wore. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, memories flooding back. Years ago, James had been a star student in college, excelling in business management. Professors admired his ambition, often predicting a bright future for him. "James," one professor had said, "with your determination, you're destined to do great things. The corporate world needs more leaders like you." James had dreams of starting his own business, something small but meaningful. He envisioned a company where everyone, regardless of their background, would be treated with respect and given equal opportunities. After graduation, James landed his first job at a mid-sized firm. He worked tirelessly, often staying late to ensure everything was perfect. His efforts didn't go unnoticed, and within a few years he was promoted to a managerial position. Life seemed to be on the right track. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. When the economy took a downturn, James's company faced severe financial challenges. Layoffs became inevitable, and despite his stellar performance, James found himself among those let go. "James, this isn't personal," his boss had said, avoiding eye contact. "We're downsizing, and unfortunately, your department is being cut." James tried to remain composed, but the news hit him like a ton of bricks. Losing his job wasn't just a financial blow, it was a hit to his self-esteem and identity. For months, James searched for another job, sending out countless resumes and attending interviews. Each rejection chipped away at his confidence. Eventually, with savings dwindling and bills piling up, he took the janitorial position at Mr. Graham's company. James wasn't just working for himself. Back home, his elderly mother relied on him for support. She had health issues that required constant attention, and medical bills were a significant burden. "James, you've already done so much for me," his mother would say, her voice tinged with guilt. "I hate to see you struggle like this." "Mom, you're my priority," James would reply, forcing a smile. "I'll figure something out." He also had a younger sister, Emma, who was in college. James had always been her biggest supporter, encouraging her to pursue her dreams. "Don't worry about the tuition," he had told her. "I'll take care of it. You just focus on your studies." Despite his own struggles, James prioritized his family's well-being, often sacrificing his own comfort for their sake. Even in the darkest moments, James never completely gave up on his dreams. Late at night, after his janitorial shift, he would sit at the small desk in his apartment, scribbling ideas in a worn notebook. One of the pages read, "Business idea, community-oriented, cleaning service. Affordable rates, eco-friendly products. Providing jobs to underprivileged individuals." James knew it was a long shot, but it gave him hope, a glimmer of something better. He often found inspiration in books and stories of self-made individuals who had risen from adversity. One book in particular stood out to him, Against All Odds, Rising from Nothing to Everything. He read it cover to cover multiple times, underlining passages that resonated with him. "Your circumstances do not define you," one line read. "Your perseverance does." James repeated those words to himself every day. Moments of reflection. On weekends, James would take long walks in the park, reflecting on his life and the choices that had brought him here. He watched families laughing together, children playing, and couples strolling hand in hand. "One day," he thought to himself, "I'll be in a place where I can provide that kind of joy and stability to my family. One day, things will be different." James's determination was fueled not just by his desire to prove himself, but by a deep sense of responsibility. He wanted to create a better future for his mother, his sister, and for people like him who were often overlooked and underestimated. One evening, while waiting for the bus after his shift, James struck up a conversation with an elderly man sitting beside him. The man, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, introduced himself as Mr. Anderson, a retired businessman. "You look like someone with a lot on his mind," Mr. Anderson said kindly. James hesitated, but eventually opened up about his struggles and dreams. To his surprise, Mr. Anderson listened intently, offering words of encouragement. "Let me tell you something, James," Mr. Anderson said. "Every great success story starts with adversity. The key is to keep going, even when it feels impossible. And remember, no one can take away your ability to dream." The conversation left a lasting impact on James, reigniting the fire within him. That night, James sat at his desk with his notebook open. He wrote at the top of the page, "Step 1. Start saving. Step 2. Never give up." For the first time in a long time, James felt a sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly how he would achieve his dreams, but he was determined to try. The CEO's arrogance. The office hummed with quiet activity. Employees moved between desks, exchanging brief conversations, and the soft tapping of keyboards filled the air. At the heart of it all was Mr. Graham, the CEO, seated in his expansive office on the top floor. The room reflected his personality, lavish yet cold. Walls lined with accolades, a mahogany desk polished to perfection, and a large leather chair symbolized his authority. Mr. Graham leaned back, reviewing reports on his tablet. His face was a mask of dissatisfaction. He rarely praised anyone's efforts and took credit for every success the company achieved. To him, employees were tools to achieve his goals, and those he deemed beneath him, like James, were invisible unless they became a target for his ridicule. Mr. Graham's interactions were often harsh and condescending. He had a sharp tongue and a quick temper, especially toward those he considered less important. "Efficiency is everything," he often said in meetings. "If you're not pulling your weight, you're dead weight." While he treated most employees poorly, his disdain for James was particularly glaring. To Mr. Graham, James wasn't just a janitor. He was a reminder of everything he looked down upon. His racist tendencies seeped into his behavior, disguised as jokes that others laughed at, uncomfortably, but dared not question. It was the annual company gala, an event meant to celebrate milestones and foster camaraderie among employees. The grand ballroom of a luxury hotel was decked out in glittering decorations. Employees dressed in their best attire mingled under the warm glow of chandeliers. James was there too, but not as a guest. He had been asked to help with cleanup duties after the event. Wearing his usual uniform, he worked discreetly, hoping to remain unnoticed. As the evening progressed, Mr. Graham took the stage to deliver his speech. The crowd fell silent as he adjusted the microphone and flashed a confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we celebrate yet another year of excellence. And, of course, none of this would be possible without my leadership." A ripple of polite laughter spread through the room. "As I look around this room," Mr. Graham continued, "I'm reminded of the importance of teamwork. From the executives who close deals to the janitors who, well, mop up after us." The audience stiffened. A few chuckled nervously, glancing toward James, who was quietly stacking plates at the back of the room. Mr. Graham's eyes landed on him. "Ah, there he is," he said, gesturing toward James. "The unsung hero of the night. James, why don't you come up here and take a bow?" James froze, his heart pounding. He knew better than to refuse, so he slowly made his way to the stage, his expression carefully neutral. The crowd parted awkwardly as he passed, and all eyes were on him. Standing next to Mr. Graham under the bright lights, James felt the heat of humiliation. "Let's give him a round of applause, everyone," Mr. Graham said, clapping theatrically. Without James, this floor might actually be dirty. The audience clapped hesitantly, their discomfort palpable. James forced a small smile, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. "Tell us, James," Mr. Graham said, leaning into the microphone, "how do you keep those floors so shiny? Do you have a secret technique?" The room filled with laughter, and James felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to disappear, but instead he replied softly, "Just doing my job, sir." "That's the spirit," Mr. Graham said, patting James on the shoulder with exaggerated enthusiasm. "A man who knows his place." The laughter grew louder. James stepped off the stage as quickly as he could, his head held low. Back in the shadows of the event, James resumed his work, but his hands trembled slightly as he cleared the tables. The humiliation lingered like a heavy weight on his chest. He heard snippets of conversations from employees nearby. "That was so uncomfortable," one whispered. "I can't believe he said that," another added. Yet no one openly defended James or spoke out against Mr. Graham. They were too afraid of jeopardizing their jobs. James didn't blame them. He had seen how Mr. Graham operated. Those who opposed him rarely lasted long at the company. Later that night, as James cleaned the now empty ballroom, he replayed the events in his mind. The anger and frustration he had buried for so long began to bubble to the surface. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. Mr. Graham's arrogance wasn't limited to James. He ruled the office with an iron fist, dismissing the ideas and contributions of his employees. Meetings were often dominated by his voice, leaving little room for collaboration. "Your job is to execute, not to think," he told one department head during a meeting. Employees whispered about his temper behind closed doors, but none dared to confront him. His favoritism for a select few and his disregard for everyone else created a toxic work environment. One particularly telling incident occurred during a project deadline. When an employee pointed out a potential flaw in the CEO's plan, Mr. Graham lashed out. "Are you questioning me?" he snapped. "I didn't get to where I am by listening to amateurs." The employee apologized profusely, and the room fell silent. The more Mr. Graham's arrogance was displayed, the more the audience's empathy for James grew. Each insult, each dismissal, each moment of public humiliation added fuel to the fire of anticipation. James's quiet resilience became a source of strength. While Mr. Graham flaunted his power, James quietly worked behind the scenes, building the foundation for his eventual triumph. This section firmly establishes Mr. Graham as the antagonist. His behavior not only alienates his employees, but also sets the stage for his downfall. His treatment of James highlights his racism and lack of humility, making the audience root for James even more. As the story progresses, the contrast between Mr. Graham's arrogance and James's perseverance will drive the narrative forward, culminating in a satisfying moment of justice. The night was still and quiet when James returned to his small apartment after the humiliating gala. The words of Mr. Graham echoed in his mind, louder than ever, "A man who knows his place." They clung to him like a heavy weight, pressing against his chest as he sat on the edge of his bed. His hands, calloused and worn from years of hard labor, trembled slightly as he stared at them. For years, James had endured the same ridicule day after day. He had kept his head down, believing that if he worked hard enough, things would eventually improve. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside him cracked. James glanced at the photo frame on his bedside table. It was a picture of him and his younger sister, Emma, from years ago. In the photo, he was beaming with pride, holding Emma's high school diploma. "You're going to achieve great things, Emma," he had told her that day, "things I couldn't." But now, looking at the photo, he felt like he had failed. Emma was still in college, relying on him to support her, and their mother's medical bills seemed to grow larger with each passing month. The pressure was suffocating. But it wasn't just his family's needs weighing him down. It was the realization that he had allowed himself to settle. He sighed deeply and opened the drawer of his bedside table. Inside was a worn notebook he had kept for years, filled with scribbles of business ideas and dreams. He flipped through the pages, his eyes landing on one that read, "A business for the people, built on respect." James smiled faintly, remembering the fire he once had. "I used to believe in this," he whispered to himself. "What happened to me?" The next day, while waiting for the bus after his shift, James noticed an older man sitting on the bench beside him. The man was dressed in a modest suit and held a newspaper in one hand. He seemed friendly, and when their eyes met, he nodded politely. "Long day?" the man asked. James hesitated, then nodded. "You could say that." The man chuckled. "You look like someone with a lot on his mind. Want to talk about it?" At first, James was reluctant, but something about the man's demeanor put him at ease. Over the next few minutes, he found himself pouring out his frustrations, the endless cycle of work, the humiliation he faced, and the dreams he had abandoned. The man listened intently, nodding occasionally. When James finished, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Let me tell you something. Every great success story begins with adversity. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" James frowned. "What can I do? I'm just a janitor." "No," the man said firmly. "You're more than that. You just need to see it for yourself. Start small. Work towards something that ignites your passion. You'd be surprised how far determination can take you." He reached into his bag and pulled out a book, handing it to James. The title read, "Against All Odds, Stories of Rising from Nothing." "Take this," the man said. "It might just change your life." That night, James sat at his desk, the book open in front of him. The stories within were unlike anything he had ever read, tales of people who had faced unimaginable challenges yet found a way to rise above them. One passage struck him deeply. "Your circumstances do not define you. Your perseverance does." James underlined the sentence, repeating it to himself like a mantra. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. As he read, ideas began to form in his mind. He opened his notebook and started writing. Save money, even if it's a little at a time. Learn new skills to improve opportunities. Start a small business, no matter how modest. Over the next few days, James worked tirelessly to create a plan. He began researching online, watching videos and reading articles about starting a business with limited resources. He discovered that many successful entrepreneurs had started with nothing but a dream and a relentless work ethic. James decided to start small. He envisioned a community-oriented cleaning service, affordable, reliable, and built on respect for its employees. "I may not have much," he thought, "but I have experience. I know how to clean better than anyone else, and I can build from that." He created a step-by-step plan in his notebook. Save a portion of his income each month, no matter how small. Learn basic business management and marketing skills through free resources. Build relationships with potential clients by networking in his neighborhood. The first step was saving money. James began cutting back on every unnecessary expense. He packed lunches instead of buying meals, walked instead of taking the bus when possible, and even took on extra shifts to increase his earnings. "It's not much," he thought as he placed a few dollars into a jar each week, "but it's a start." James's journey was far from easy. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, and moments when doubt crept in, whispering that his efforts were futile. But every time he felt like giving up, he returned to the book and the words he had underlined. "Your circumstances do not define you." One particularly difficult day, James received a rejection from a potential client he had approached for his cleaning service. "I'm sorry," the client said. "We're going with a bigger company." James forced a smile and thanked them, but the rejection stung. He sat on a park bench afterward, his notebook in hand. "Maybe this is too much," he thought. "Maybe I'm aiming too high." But then he remembered the old man's words. Start small. Work toward something that ignites your passion. He took a deep breath and wrote in his notebook, "Rejection is not failure. It's part of the process." Despite the setbacks, James began to see progress. He landed his first small contract cleaning a local cafe, and the owner was impressed with his work. "You're thorough and professional," the owner said. "I'll recommend you to others." That first contract gave James a boost of confidence. He started dreaming bigger, not just of financial stability, but of creating a business that would one day rival the very company where he had been humiliated. One evening, as James sat at his desk, he wrote in bold letters at the top of a blank page, "I will rise above my circumstances. I will succeed." With every dollar saved, every skill learned, and every step taken, James felt himself moving closer to his goal. For the first time in years, he went to bed, not with the weight of humiliation, but with the fire of determination burning brightly within him. James stared at the neatly folded bills on his small dining table. It wasn't much, just a few $100s he had managed to save over several months, but it was enough to start something. This is where it begins, he thought, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. He carefully outlined a budget in his notebook. $50 for cleaning supplies, $20 for business cards, $30 for transportation costs. Every dollar had to be accounted for, leaving no room for error. James knew that starting small was the only way forward. James decided to start his business as a one-man operation, focusing on offering personalized, high-quality cleaning services to small local businesses. The first step was creating a name. After much thought, he settled on Shine Bright Cleaning Services. The name reflected his commitment to excellence and his hope for a brighter future. Next, James designed simple business cards using free online tools. Each card bore his name, contact information, and a tagline: professional, reliable, affordable. With supplies in hand and cards in his pocket, James hit the streets. He began visiting local businesses, introducing himself to owners, and offering his services. At first, the responses were underwhelming. "No, thank you," one cafe owner said. "We already have a cleaner." Another business owner dismissed him outright, saying, "Why would we hire an individual when we can get a company to do it?" Rejection after rejection piled up, and James began to question whether he was making a mistake. One day, after a particularly disheartening round of rejections, James sat on a park bench, staring at his notebook. The words he had written earlier, "Start small, work hard, never give up," now felt hollow. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," he muttered. But as he looked around, he saw a young boy practicing soccer nearby. The boy missed shot after shot, but each time he retrieved the ball and tried again. James smiled faintly. "If that kid can keep going, so can I," he thought. One afternoon, James walked into a small neighborhood cafe. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Carter, greeted him with a warm smile. "What can I do for you, young man?" she asked. James introduced himself and explained his services, handing her one of his business cards. Mrs. Carter studied the card thoughtfully. "We've been looking for someone to clean after hours," she said. "How soon can you start?" James felt a surge of relief. "Right away, ma'am. I can start tonight." That evening, James worked tirelessly to clean every corner of the cafe. He scrubbed, polished, and mopped until the place sparkled. When Mrs. Carter returned the next morning, she was impressed. "You did an excellent job," she said. "I'll tell my friends about you." Mrs. Carter's recommendation led to another small job, and then another. Slowly but surely, James began to build a network of clients. He kept meticulous records of his earnings and expenses, ensuring every dollar was reinvested into growing his business. He upgraded his supplies, added a professional uniform, and even created a simple website using free tools. As his business grew, so did the challenges. One of his biggest hurdles was transportation. Without a car, James relied on public buses and walking to reach his clients. This often meant waking up hours earlier and carrying heavy supplies across long distances. One rainy morning, James slipped on a wet sidewalk, scattering his supplies across the pavement. Frustrated and soaked, he sat on the curb, feeling defeated. "This is too hard," he thought. "Maybe I'm pushing myself too far." But then he remembered his mother's words. "James, you've never been a quitter. Don't start now." He picked himself up, gathered his supplies, and pushed forward. James realized that if he wanted to grow his business, he needed to learn new skills. In his limited free time, he took online courses on business management, customer service, and marketing. He learned how to communicate effectively with clients, negotiate contracts, and promote his services on social media. One of his posts, showcasing a before and after cleaning job, went viral in the local community. Suddenly, more people were reaching out, asking about his services. Despite his growing client base, money was still tight. James often had to choose between upgrading his equipment and covering his basic living expenses. To save costs, he started buying used cleaning machines and repairing them himself. He also negotiated with suppliers for discounts on bulk purchases. Each small victory fueled his determination. One day, James received a call from a property manager who oversaw several office buildings. "I've heard good things about your work," the manager said. "Would you be interested in taking on a monthly contract for 3 of our buildings?" James could hardly believe it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. "Yes," he replied, "I'd be honored." The new contract marked a turning point for Shine Bright cleaning services. James hired his first employee, a young man named Kevin, who had been struggling to find work. As his business continued to grow, James remained true to his values. He prioritized hiring people who, like him, had faced difficult circumstances, but were willing to work hard. "I know what it's like to feel overlooked," he told his team. "That's why this business is about more than just cleaning. It's about giving people a chance." With each success, James began to dream bigger. He envisioned expanding his business beyond the local community, offering services to larger corporations. One evening, as he reviewed his finances and plans, he wrote in his notebook, "One day I'll own the very company where I was humiliated. I'll prove that no one should be underestimated." James's journey was far from over, but he had come a long way from where he started. Through hard work, resilience, and a refusal to give up, he had transformed his life. And he was just getting started. At first glance, Mr. Graham's company appeared to be thriving. The tall glass building stood as a symbol of success, bustling with activity as employees hurried from meeting to meeting. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. For years, Mr. Graham's leadership style had been based on fear and control. He demanded perfection, but offered little in return. His arrogance alienated employees, and his refusal to listen to feedback stifled innovation. In meetings, he dismissed suggestions with a wave of his hand. "Stick to your job descriptions," he would say. "I'm the one with the vision here." The once dedicated staff began to lose motivation. Talented employees left for better opportunities, and those who stayed did the bare minimum to avoid confrontation. The turning point came when a respected department head, Mr. Evans, resigned. Mr. Graham barely acknowledged it, shrugging it off as one less complainer to deal with. But Evans' departure sent shockwaves through the company. "Evans was the backbone of this place," whispered one employee. "If even he's leaving, what does that say about the rest of us?" Morale plummeted. The remaining employees began to talk openly in hushed tones about their frustrations. "He doesn't care about us," said one. "We're just numbers to him." "And look at the turnover," added another. "We can't keep good people because no one wants to work under him." Even clients began to notice the decline. Projects were delayed, mistakes were made, and the once strong reputation of Mr. Graham's company started to falter. The first major client to leave was a longtime partner, a firm that had worked with the company for over a decade. The news came during a quarterly meeting. "They've decided to go with a competitor," the marketing director announced, her voice hesitant. Mr. Graham slammed his hand on the table. "How is that possible? We've been working with them for years." "They mentioned delays and a lack of communication," she replied carefully. Mr. Graham's face turned red. "This is unacceptable. Find out who's responsible and fire them." The room fell silent. No one dared to point out that the issues stemmed from Mr. Graham's own micromanagement and refusal to delegate. While Mr. Graham's company was crumbling, James's cleaning business was thriving. Word-of-mouth recommendations and glowing reviews helped Shine Bright Cleaning Services expand rapidly. James had now hired a small team, including individuals who had faced challenges similar to his own. He instilled in them a sense of pride and purpose, ensuring that everyone felt valued and respected. One day, as James cleaned an office that had recently contracted his services, he overheard two employees discussing their dissatisfaction with Mr. Graham's company. "I heard they lost another client," one said. "Not surprising," replied the other. "Their CEO is impossible to work with." James smiled to himself. The contrast between his rising success and Mr. Graham's downfall was becoming more evident. Despite the growing problems, Mr. Graham refused to acknowledge his role in the company's decline. During a staff meeting, he addressed the recent losses with his usual bravado. "We're going through a rough patch," he said, pacing the room. "But this company has always succeeded because of my leadership, and it will continue to do so." The employees exchanged skeptical glances. They had heard this speech before, and it rang hollow. Outside the meeting room, the whispers grew louder. Employees were updating their resumes, attending interviews, and quietly planning their exits. Despite the growing problems, Mr. Graham refused to acknowledge his role in the company's decline. During a staff meeting, he addressed the recent losses with his usual bravado. "We're going through a rough patch," he said, pacing the room. "But this company has always succeeded because of my leadership, and it will continue to do so." The employees exchanged skeptical glances. They had heard this speech before, and it rang hollow. Outside the meeting room, the whispers grew louder. Employees were updating their resumes, attending interviews, and quietly planning their exits. The breaking point came when the company lost a multi-million-dollar contract with a major corporation. It was a deal Mr. Graham had touted as the key to the company's future growth. The news came as a shock. The client had cited a lack of professionalism and repeated delays as the reasons for pulling out. Mr. Graham was furious. "This is sabotage," he shouted during an emergency meeting. "Someone inside this company is working against me." But deep down, even he began to realize that his grip on the company was slipping. For the first time, Mr. Graham started to feel the weight of his own failures. While Mr. Graham's arrogance led to his downfall, James's humility and hard work propelled him forward. James continued to expand his client base, securing contracts with small businesses and even larger firms. His reputation for reliability and respectability set him apart. One day, James received a surprising call from a former employee of Mr. Graham's company. "I've heard great things about your business," the caller said. "Are you hiring?" James smiled. "We're always looking for dedicated people," he replied. The contrast between James and Mr. Graham became a symbol of two different paths, one built on arrogance and exploitation, and the other on hard work and respect. As Mr. Graham's company teetered on the edge of collapse, James began to see an opportunity. He started exploring ways to invest his growing earnings, consulting with mentors and financial advisors. One evening, as James reviewed his plans, he wrote in his notebook, "One day I'll take over that company, not for revenge, but to build something better." The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between James and Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham's poor leadership had finally caught up with him. His company, once a symbol of success, was now a shadow of its former self. Employees had left, clients had moved on, and even his closest allies had distanced themselves. Meanwhile, James stood ready to seize the moment. With determination in his heart and a clear vision for the future, he prepared to take the next step in his journey, a step that would change everything. James sat at his desk, reviewing the financial reports he had requested from his advisor. His cleaning business, Shine Bright Cleaning Services, had grown beyond his wildest dreams. With a steady stream of clients, a dedicated team, and strong financial management, the company had become a regional leader in professional cleaning services. But James wasn't satisfied. He had a bigger vision. For years, the humiliation he endured at Mr. Graham's company lingered in his mind, not as a source of anger, but as fuel to drive him forward. "I'm not just going to succeed," James thought to himself. "I'm going to make things right." He had been quietly monitoring the struggles of Mr. Graham's company. Employee dissatisfaction, client losses, and declining revenues had created the perfect storm. The once thriving company was now on the brink of collapse, desperately seeking investors to stay afloat. James knew this was his moment. With the help of his financial advisor, James crafted a plan to acquire Mr. Graham's company. Though Shine Bright Cleaning Services had been profitable, the acquisition required additional funding. James reached out to potential investors, presenting his vision for transforming the failing company into a model of integrity and respect. One of the investors, Mr. Patel, was intrigued by James's story. "You've come a long way," Mr. Patel said, reviewing the proposal. "Why do you want this particular company? There are other businesses you could buy." James hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Because this isn't just about business. It's about creating something better for the employees, for the clients, and for people like me who were overlooked and underestimated." Mr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "Let's do it." With the funding secured, James moved quickly. He negotiated with the board of directors, who were eager to sell, seeing no other way to save the company. After weeks of discussions, the deal was finalized. James had officially acquired Mr. Graham's company. It was a typical Monday morning at the corporate office. Employees shuffled in, weary and uninspired. The air was thick with tension. Rumors of the company's struggles had been circulating for months. Mr. Graham, as usual, was in his office, barking orders at his assistant and preparing for yet another meeting with potential investors. He refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation, clinging to the belief that he could turn things around. But the mood shifted when James walked into the building. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, James exuded confidence. He held his head high as he stepped into the lobby, where a few employees glanced up, confused by his presence. "Isn't that the janitor?" one whispered. "What's he doing here?" James ignored the murmurs and made his way to the conference room, where the department heads had gathered for a meeting. He pushed open the doors and stepped inside, the room falling silent as everyone turned to look at him. At the head of the table sat Mr. Graham, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "James," Mr. Graham said, his voice dripping with disdain, "what are you doing here?" James smiled calmly and walked to the head of the table, standing tall as he addressed the room. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice steady. "As of today, I am the new owner of this company." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Employees exchanged shocked glances, struggling to process what they had just heard. Mr. Graham shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "This is some kind of joke," he said, his voice trembling. "You, a janitor, owning this company?" James met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, me," he replied. "And it's not a joke. The deal was finalized last week. The board approved it." Mr. Graham sank back into his chair, stunned into silence. James took a deep breath and looked around the room. The faces of the employees told a story: confusion, hope, and in some cases, skepticism. "I know many of you are wondering how this happened," James said, "and I'll explain everything. But first, let me say this. I'm not here to humiliate anyone or seek revenge. I'm here to rebuild, to make this company a place where everyone is treated with respect and given the opportunity to thrive." He glanced at Mr. Graham, who avoided his gaze. "For years I worked in this building, cleaning floors and emptying trash bins. I saw how this company was run, and I saw the toll it took on the people who worked here. That's going to change." One of the employees, a young woman named Sarah, raised her hand hesitantly. "Does this mean Mr. Graham is leaving?" James paused before answering. "That decision is up to him. But I'll say this. The culture of this company will no longer tolerate arrogance or disrespect. If anyone, whether they're at the top or the bottom, cannot align with that vision, they're free to leave." After the meeting, Mr. Graham stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. He paced back and forth, his mind racing. The humiliation of being ousted by a former janitor was almost too much to bear. But as he sat down at his desk, he realized the truth. He had brought this on himself. His arrogance, his refusal to listen, and his mistreatment of others had led to this moment. The next day, Mr. Graham submitted his resignation. With Mr. Graham gone, James wasted no time implementing changes. He held meetings with each department, listening to employees' concerns and ideas. For the first time in years, the staff felt heard. James also introduced new policies to improve work-life balance, ensure fair treatment, and foster a collaborative environment. Slowly but surely, the morale of the employees began to improve. One employee approached James after a meeting and said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually look forward to coming to work now." "Thank you," James smiled. "This is just the beginning." One evening, as James stood in his new corner office, he looked out at the city skyline. The same building that had once been a symbol of his struggles was now a testament to his perseverance. He picked up his notebook, the one he had carried with him through every step of his journey, and flipped to a page he had written years ago. "One day I'll rise above my circumstances." James closed the notebook with a satisfied smile. He had done more than rise above. He had transformed. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried the weight of anticipation. James stood at the head of the long, polished table, his suit crisp and his demeanor composed. Across from him sat Mr. Graham, his face a mix of defiance and unease. Around them, employees and department heads watched intently, their expressions a blend of curiosity and disbelief. This was the moment James had envisioned for years, not for revenge, but for closure. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he prepared to speak. James began with a calm, measured tone. "Mr. Graham," he said, meeting the older man's gaze, "I've waited a long time for this moment, not to humiliate you, but to remind everyone in this room of something we've all forgotten: respect." He turned to the employees seated around the table. "When I worked in this building as a janitor, I saw things most of you didn't. I saw the frustration in your faces, the weight of unspoken words, and the fear of challenging authority. I felt it too, but most importantly, I saw a culture that thrived on division rather than collaboration, arrogance rather than humility." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on James. "I cleaned these floors," James continued, gesturing toward the polished wood beneath his feet. "I emptied your trash bins and wiped down your desks. And every night as I worked, I listened. I heard your concerns, your frustrations, your dreams, and while I couldn't speak up then, I can now." James turned back to Mr. Graham, whose jaw tightened as he braced himself for what was to come. "Mr. Graham, you once said to me, 'A man should know his place.' For years I believed that my place was at the bottom, unseen and unheard. But today I stand here as the owner of this company, not because I wanted to prove you wrong, but because I wanted to prove myself right. The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Graham's usual bravado seemed to waver as James continued. You built this company with skill and ambition, but somewhere along the way, you forgot the most important element of leadership: respect for the people who make success possible. You dismissed their ideas, ignored their efforts, and treated them as disposable. And that is why this company faltered, not because of the market, not because of competition, but because of a culture of disrespect. James stepped away from the table, pacing slowly as he spoke. Respect isn't given based on titles or positions, he said. It's earned through the way we treat others. It's earned by listening, by valuing contributions, and by understanding that no one is beneath anyone else. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Today, this company begins a new chapter. We will build a culture where every voice matters, where hard work is recognized, and where collaboration replaces arrogance. This isn't just about me or Mr. Graham. It's about all of us. For the first time in his career, Mr. Graham was speechless. The man who had always dominated conversations, who had never hesitated to cut others down, now found himself unable to respond. His face reddened, not with anger, but with the weight of realization. The room's silence pressed down on him as he replayed James's words in his mind. Mr. Graham began, his voice faltering. I didn't realize. James raised a hand, stopping him gently. It's not too late to change, James said. But change starts with acknowledging the harm we've caused and committing to do better. James could have used this moment to humiliate Mr. Graham further, to revel in his victory, but he didn't. Instead, he extended a hand toward the man who had once belittled him. This isn't about revenge, James said. It's about building something better. I hope you'll take this opportunity to reflect and grow just as I've had to. Mr. Graham hesitated, his pride warring with his conscience. But finally he shook James's hand, his grip firm yet reluctant. Thank you, Mr. Graham said quietly, for giving me a chance to make things right. As James stepped back, the room erupted in applause. The employees, many of whom had suffered under Mr. Graham's leadership, looked at James with a mix of admiration and relief. You've given us hope, one employee said. This company finally feels like a place where we belong. James nodded, his heart swelling with pride. This is just the beginning, he said. Together, we're going to rebuild this company into something we can all be proud of. Later that day, James invited Mr. Graham to his office for a private conversation. I meant what I said earlier, James began. This isn't about humiliating you. It's about moving forward. Mr. Graham sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I let my ego get in the way, he admitted. I stopped listening, stopped caring, and I lost everything because of it. James leaned forward. You haven't lost everything. You still have the chance to make amends, not just to me, but to the employees you've impacted. Mr. Graham nodded slowly. I'll think about it, he said. As the day came to a close, James stood at the window of his corner office, gazing out at the city skyline. He thought about how far he had come, from a janitor mopping floors to the owner of a company he had once been invisible in. But this was more than a personal victory. It was a chance to create a legacy, to prove that respect and hard work could achieve what arrogance and power never could. James smiled, his reflection in the glass a reminder of everything he had endured and overcome. This is just the start, he said softly. The best is yet to come. James walked into the office on his first official day as the new owner. The atmosphere felt different. Employees greeted him with cautious smiles, their curiosity evident. Many were still in disbelief that the man who once mopped the floors was now at the helm of the company. James gathered the entire staff in the large conference room for his first address. "Good morning, everyone," he began, standing at the podium. "Today marks a new chapter for this company, a chapter built on respect, collaboration, and growth." He paused, scanning the room. "I understand that change can be unsettling, especially after everything this company has been through. But I want to assure you, my vision isn't just about financial success. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued, heard, and empowered." The employees exchanged glances, their skepticism beginning to wane as James continued. James wasted no time implementing changes. He introduced a series of new policies aimed at fostering equality and professional development. Open communication channels. James established regular town hall meetings where employees could voice their concerns and share ideas directly with the leadership team. Employee development programs, training sessions, mentorship opportunities, and tuition reimbursement programs were introduced to help employees advance their careers. Diversity and inclusion initiatives. James created a diversity council to ensure the company's hiring practices were inclusive and its workplace culture welcoming. Work-life balance, flexible work hours, and additional paid leave were implemented to prioritize employees' well-being. Within weeks, the impact of these changes was visible. Employees who had once seemed disengaged were now enthusiastic and motivated. Productivity increased, and the company began attracting top talent from across the industry. For the first time in years, the employees felt hopeful about their future at the company. "James actually listens to us," one employee said during a break. "He's not just a boss, he's a leader." Another employee added, "It feels like we're part of something bigger now, something meaningful." The shift in morale was evident. The office buzzed with energy and collaboration, and even clients began to notice the change. While the company flourished under James's leadership, Mr. Graham found himself at a crossroads. After stepping down as CEO, he initially struggled to adjust to his new reality. In the weeks following his resignation, Mr. Graham avoided the office, choosing instead to reflect on his life and career. For the first time, he began to confront the consequences of his arrogance and disregard for others. One day, he reached out to James. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically humble. James agreed, inviting Mr. Graham to his office. "I wanted to thank you," Mr. Graham said, his voice quiet. "Not just for giving me a chance to reflect, but for showing me what true leadership looks like." James nodded. "Growth is always possible, Mr. Graham. It's never too late to make things right." With James's encouragement, Mr. Graham decided to step away from the corporate world entirely. He dedicated himself to mentoring young professionals, using his experiences, both good and bad, to guide others. One evening, after a particularly productive day, James sat alone in his office. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a stark contrast to the humble apartment where his journey had begun. On his desk lay the notebook he had carried with him throughout his struggles. He opened it to a page he had written years ago. Step 1, start saving. Step 2, never give up. He smiled, running his fingers over the words. James leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting through the memories of his journey. The humiliation he endured as a janitor, the late nights spent building his business, the moment he walked into the office as the new owner. Each step, no matter how painful or challenging, had led him to this moment. James stood and walked to the large window, gazing out at the bustling city below. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the obstacles he had overcome, and the lessons he had learned. Finally, he spoke softly, as if addressing his younger self. Life will knock you down again and again, but it's not about where you start, it's about where you choose to go. Hard work, respect, and resilience can take you further than anyone imagines. He turned back to his desk, closing the notebook with a sense of closure. The following week, James hosted an open house for clients and employees to celebrate the company's transformation. The event was held in the same grand ballroom where he had once been humiliated by Mr. Graham. But this time, James stood on the stage as a leader, surrounded by a team that believed in him and a company that reflected his values. As he addressed the crowd, his voice was filled with gratitude and determination. "This isn't just my success," he said. "It's ours. Together, we've proven that respect and perseverance can create something extraordinary." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the hall as James smiled, knowing this was only the beginning of the legacy he was building.